January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and Camilo Cienfuegos led the victorious revolutionary forces into Havana. I think this picture is from that march. Yes. With the victory of the Cuban Revolution and the ouster of the hated Batista regime, President Eisenhower declared an embargo on all trade with Cuba. Kennedy followed through with those plans to storm the Bay of Pigs in April 1961. Following that defeat of the invasion, Fidel declared Cuba a socialist country and allied with a communist world. Yes. Then, the U.S. government, under direction of both Kennedys, created Operation Mongoose in 1962. Those were failed CIA attempts to oust leadership and assassinate Fidel. Next came in October of '62, Kennedy declared that the Soviet Union's military support for Cuba was a threat to the U.S. and ordered a naval blockade of the island, which led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is an entirely different talk. All of these attempts strengthened the resolve of the Cuban people and the government to advance the socialist revolution. Though the U.S. Navy may have moved away from surrounding the island, the blockade continued on the economic front. In order to keep building the country's economy and meeting the needs for housing, schools, medical care, and all the other basic needs, Cuba had to find ways to begin to develop exports. Under the U.S. control, the island's economy was focused on sugar primarily and some of the nickel deposits found there. Because U.S. imperialism was strong-arming the capitalist world, the Soviet Union stepped in to buy sugar from Cuba. In 1969, Fidel proposed a 10 million ton sugar cane harvest to show the world that Cuba's economy was strong. Never been done before. Was a real stretch for the country to undertake. That October, he spoke about the harvest in an address to the Cuban people. Quote, "We do not believe that the only meritorious or difficult task of the revolution has been the 10 million ton harvest. No. The ideological battle against imperialism, the disappearances of prejudice, to grind into pieces all the reactionary lies of imperialism and the exploiters, to resist its economic blockades, its campaigns, its attacks, resist its aggressions, are merits of no little consideration. But the revolution needed this other trial, decisive for today, decisive for tomorrow. And we are certain that the matter of the 10 million tons will resound more in the world as far as the Cuban Revolution is concerned than any other act of the revolution during these years." He finished that address with, "And if the revolution was able to emerge victorious in these past 10 years, in the next decade, we will more righteously be able to say that nothing nor no one can hold it back." It was that harvest that captured the attention of revolutionary youth in Students for Democratic Society in the U.S., who wanted to find a way to support the Cuban Revolution and celebrate its 10th anniversary. The details were not written down, so exactly who and where the idea came from is debated. What is known is that these youth volunteered to come down to work in offices, hospitals, wherever was needed to cover for the workers who went out to work the harvest. Fidel said, "Thank you, but if you come, you must work in the fields alongside the workers, not in the offices." Yes. Thus, the Venceremos Brigade was formed. Over 200 youth, many who were Black and Latinx revolutionaries, inspired by the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, as well as inspired by Cuba, went on the 1st Brigade in November 1969. In February of '70, Comrade Bill Sachs went on the 2nd Brigade, which also worked on the harvest. I went on the 3rd Brigade that arrived in August 1970 to work on the Isla de Juventud, picking lemons and limes, as well as planting and fertilizing other crops. Subsequent brigades have worked on constructing towns around the island, as well as building and improving the Julio Antonio Mella International Camp, where where other international brigades, as well as the Venceremos Brigade, often stay while in Cuba, or doing whatever was needed at the time the brigade was there. The VB also challenges the U.S. ban on travel to Cuba. Early brigades had, I believe it was 1960 or 61, when there was a complete ban on free travel to Cuba imposed by the U.S. Early brigades had to travel through Canada, taking a converted cargo ship down to Cuba. As the size of the brigades grew smaller, plane travel was possible through Canada or Mexico. Even in the Obama years, with the loosening of restrictions allowing for specific licensed trips, the VB continued to challenge the travel ban and to go without official permission. I should add here that that meant that anybody who went on the brigade without a license could potentially be put into jail, could face a lot of fines. I think it was $50,000 from the government. So it was a big action for most people at that time to do that. In addition to working alongside Cubans, brigadistas learn about socialism, about Cuba, about international struggles, and sometimes have the opportunity to meet with other opponents of U.S. imperialism. The early VB brigadistas often met with fighters from the National Liberation Front of Vietnam, from the Khmer Rouge of Kampuchea, now Cambodia, other brigadistas from the Democratic Republic of Korea that came to support the revolution, as well as revolutionary fighters from Angola, South Africa, and Namibia. The Venceremos Brigade continued to send groups to Cuba every year, though in the recent decades, participation has been lower. More than 10,000 people have gone to Cuba on the brigade. This year marked the 50th anniversary of the Venceremos Brigade. As the organization with the longest history of direct solidarity with Cuba, the Cuban Institute of Friendship of the Peoples, ECAP, went all out to support the largest group in years. Now, as an aside, there are many groups that have been in solidarity with Cuba and supported the revolution longer than the Venceremos Brigade. Workers' World Party, for example. We're also unique in that Workers' World is one of the only left organizations that has consistently participated on the brigade trips, as well as we also support and work with IFCO Pastors for Peace caravans in support of Cuba. 150 people went on this year's trip, and that's a reflection of the rise in interest in socialism and the spur in activism that's been going on. Over half were people of color. Ages ranged from a few people born in the 1930s to some born in the 2010s. This was also the largest number of LGBTQ brigadistas to ever go to Cuba. Again, primarily young people of color. Yes. To find ways to make it possible for elders and people with disabilities to participate, there were different trip lengths offered, from 5 days, 10 days, 2 weeks, and 3 weeks. Included was a 5-day option to stay at a hotel for those who have more difficulties with the heat or uneven grounds or bunk beds. This trip came at a time of renewed attacks on Cuba. Restrictions on tourist travel, which accounts for a major portion of Cuba's source for cash for the global marketplace. The implementation, finally, of the under Trump ordering of the Helms-Burton Act, which allows Cubans who left after the revolution, as well as U.S.-based companies whose facilities were expropriated, to sue for the return of properties and benefits made by those who took over their lands and businesses. And then the restriction on all travel to Cuba, even licensed trips, just days before we were to leave. Because of these increasing attacks on Cuba and Venezuela, this year, ECAP requested that the trip actually be a licensed trip for the first time to ensure that the group could come. And it was that license that did make it possible, because anyone with tickets already purchased could travel even after the latest restrictions. But even though there was a license for this trip, it was still a challenge and remains a travel challenge. And going to Cuba and and fighting for the right for everyone to travel freely to Cuba remains a main part of the Venceremos Brigade's work. This anniversary is very important to the Cubans. They fully recognize that the U.S. government does not represent the people of the U.S. The solidarity that has been shown by the brigade and others means that the Cuban people have a special affection for the people from the U.S. who come in defiance of the government. Despite the deepening economic difficulties that Cuba faces with the tightening of the restrictions on Venezuela's oil exports, ECAP planned a program that kept us very busy and going. Throughout those days, there were many presentations and discussions covering Cuban life, from the electoral process to racial relations, to LGBTQ progress and challenges that remain, from women's roles to trade unions and education. There were also opportunities to travel to Che's Memorial in Villa Clara, Las Terrazas Biosphere Reserve in Artemisa Province, which Comrade Stephanie wrote about in the paper about 3 weeks ago, the town of Viñales in Pinar del Rio Province, or the Veradero Beach on the Icacos Peninsula. Brigadistas also got to choose to visit CNeuro, the Center of Neurosciences, founded in 1969 as one of the first groups in the world to use informatics for analysis of the brain's electrical activity, and is now making 3D printed hearing aids based on scanning a person's ear canal, which for some of us is really a remarkable thing. Yeah. Labiofams, the Laboratorios Biológicos Farmacéuticos, recognized internationally for its work on veterinary vaccines, was another option, or the CIGB, the Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology, a leader in Cuba's pharmaceutical industry, which some comrades and friends may know that Cuba has developed vaccines for lung cancer that the U.S. refuses to bring here, as well as important treatments for diabetes that the U.S. refuses to allow or acknowledge. Given the special character of this trip and because of fuel shortages, the work opportunities were not as, were focused really on improving the camp, cleaning overgrowth and picking beans and cleaning barracks in the common areas, rather than going out to work with, alongside the Cuban people. The Committee for the Defense of the Revolution for Caimito, the town near the camp, hosted a night of dancing and singing, followed by opening their homes to brigadistas to share food and conversation so that we could walk through the village and meet the people living there. The town was constructed in part by the Venceremos Brigade. There were other programs as well, as a visit to the memorial to the martyrs of the revolution in Artemisa, the center of Artemisa province. Many of the early combatants of the revolutions came from there. ECAP's official marking of the 50th anniversary was a program at its headquarters, featuring talks by one of the people on the 1st Brigade, Leslie Kagan, who some of you may know, Rachel Ibrahim and Malcolm Sachs, who have guided the VB over the last decade, and some of you may know one of his relatives. Musical presentation and a keynote from Fernando Gonzalez Yort, president of ECAP. Now that he has been released from the clutches of U.S. imperialism, he was one of the Cuban Five. Truly an honor to be there. After the brigadistas on the 5- and 10-day trips left, and that included me, the brigade toured the eastern provinces. Bill was on the 3-week trip, and we'll give some highlights from that portion of the trip. The Venceremos Brigade will continue organizing support for Cuba. Dates have not been set yet, but planning is underway to go next year. It is a tremendous experience to step onto liberated territory. As one of the teachers from the Bronx who went for the first time this year said to her students, imagine being on a bus, train, or car ride where you don't see any advertisements. Nothing telling you to buy anything. Nothing telling you to make yourself look better, whatever that is in your mind. Nothing telling you to enlist in the Army. Nothing telling you to go to this restaurant. All you see are the people in front of you and your own hands. She went on to say, we entered this world where buying stuff, where being online, where being able to check an Instagram post or ordering something on Uber Eats wasn't possible, nor did anyone care about it. Yes, it was an incredible experience.
I just wanted to mention the role of the party that the party has played in the brigade for all these years. As Jean mentioned, party members have gone on many of the brigades. I would say almost practically a good majority of the brigades. Comrades have also worked on local steering committees and national committees and have been a part of the work of the Venceremos Brigade for years, as well as having participated in the brigades. In addition, in the early years, as Jean mentioned, people were subject to possible jail, large fines, and many of the trips were kind of clandestine and secret. People sort of got up to Canada on their own. It wasn't publicized. But as the work for Cuba Solidarity improved, the brigade made a decision to publicize what they were doing when they returned. And in recent years, the brigade, they would, for many years, they would come back through Buffalo and march over the Peace Bridge with a banner, and to announce that they were coming back, traveling without a license, to end the travel restriction. And every one of those years, they were met by a contingent of Workers' World comrades from the Buffalo branch, who had their own banner on the U.S. side, welcoming them back, and handing out flyers, calling the press, and bringing food for the brigadistas who had just traveled back. So the party has a long history in support of the brigade and the Cuban struggle. The brigade, in addition to working on these trips, has been active in Cuba support groups, and worked very actively to free the Cuban Five, worked to free Elian Gonzalez, and other, other aspects of the Cuban solidarity struggle. This trip, again, as Jean mentioned, was a very special trip. It was the 50th anniversary of the brigade. Many of us who had gone in the early years hoped that we wouldn't have to have a 50th brigade, that the blockade would have been ended. And when we would say that to the Cubans, almost apologetically, they would say, it doesn't matter, just keep coming. Just keep coming. Eventually, we will win. And that's really the attitude of the Cubans. Their position really is, the more people that come to Cuba and see Cuba, the better. And that's why ending the travel restrictions is so important to them. Because they know that when people come to see Cuba, that it puts to shame all the lies that the U.S. has told people about Cuba. And I think about 90 of the brigadistas this year were first-timers, and they came away really not, with that understanding. Many of them, since we've been back, have volunteered to work on future brigades. And now the local committee in New York has tripled in size from what it was, just to organize this brigade. The brigade is an all-volunteer organization, and the leadership is made up of a group of responsables, people who have volunteered to put in extra time to help coordinate, do the logistics, work with the Cubans. Comrade Jean and I were both responsables. On this particular trip, there was a group of about 25 of us. And we continue to meet and hopefully bring in others, to do more trips. As Jean mentioned, this was the first time that the brigade went in 3 travel lengths. There was, or 4 travel lengths, 5 days, 10 days, 2 weeks, and 3 weeks. The first group was at the camp that was built, as Jean said, by some of the former brigadistas. I will say that one of Jean's responsibilities was to work with the people who were staying at the hotels, the more elderly people, disabled people, helping them get to the camp for events and to other areas. That was one of her responsibilities. And the responsables tried to work with all the brigadistas so that it went smoothly, and I believe that it did. After we left the camp, a group of people traveled to really the whole island. We went to Camagüey, Santiago, Granma Province, and Guantanamo. And in each location, the Cubans welcomed us as almost as heroes. They were aware of the Venceremos Brigade, and we're so thankful for the support that we have given to the Cubans for all these years. We were usually welcomed in a ceremony, an official ceremony with party officials, government officials, municipal officials, and always a group of children, school children, who would do a performance for us. And just to show the importance that the Cuban people place on the children, really the future of the country. And the performances were, just amazing. 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old. In fact, for the July 26th official ceremony, one of the keynote speakers was a young woman, an 8th grader, who gave a speech, an amazing speech about education in Cuba and the martyrs of July 26th. There was also a high school student who spoke. Again, the emphasis on the youth. And this new generation of leaders who have lived their entire life in the revolution. They were born into the revolution. And it really showed in every location that we went to. In Santiago, we visited, there's a museum and memorial for some of the martyrs from the Second Front, which was led by Raul. His compañera, Vilma Espín, is buried there, and we had a ceremony there. When we visited Granma Province, of course, Granma is the yacht that Fidel and his comrades took from Mexico in 1956 to come back to Cuba to start the revolution. And we visited where the yacht landed. It actually went aground before it got to the shore. And the Cubans have built like a boardwalk out to it, and we were able to stand there and walk back, through the marsh and the twigs and the trees. And of course, when they tried to get back on land, they had to decide whether to take machetes to cut through the brush or guns, and of course they chose the guns. And it took hours and hours, and they got there and escaped. They were met some of them by Batista's forces, and only a few survived. Many were arrested, only a few survived. But finally, when Raul and Fidel met up, I think a day or two later, Fidel said to Raul, I have two guns, 2 rifles. What do you have? He says, I have 5. So Fidel goes, that makes 7. Now we can start the fight. And they did. And that's been the story of the Cuban revolutionaries all through the battle and even since. They consider the revolution ongoing. The revolution began in 1868 with the slave rebellion and continues to this day to build socialism. In fact, in Santiago, there's a monument to the escaped slaves. It's a beautiful sculpture. We met the sculptor who did it and had a good discussion with him. It's on the top of a mountain in the highest place in Santiago, and it's a memorial to the slaves who fought against the Spanish in the beginning of the Cuban Revolution. In Guantanamo, we also went to Guantanamo. Many people, some of the people on the brigade, when you hear Guantanamo, they think, oh, it's the military, it's the naval base, that's it. But Guantanamo is actually a province in Cuba, and because of the naval base, it suffers probably the most of any province from underdevelopment and inability to develop economically because the base is there. The base occupies the harbor, which is, I think, one of the deep sea harbors, ports in Cuba. And if the Cubans had that land, which is theirs, they could have, a very busy commercial port. In addition, the U.S. Ships don't allow the Cubans to fish in that area, and it hurts the fishing industry as well. And the people of Guantanamo put on they had a whole film that they had made showing the struggle, their struggle, and we made and every place that we went, we would bring material aid. Every brigadista was told to pack one suitcase with their personal belongings and one with material aid, school supplies, computer supplies, clothes, work boots, things like that. And we would have a presentation and deliver material aid to every place we went. And we tried to bring a lot or the most to the Granma province. We also did volunteer work in every city that we went to. We did agricultural work, planting sweet potatoes and picking vegetables, plowing some land behind oxen in order to so that the seeds could be planted. And we worked with Cubans. One day we worked with high school students who came and worked alongside of us. Another day we worked with university students in every city. So it really was a remarkable experience for both the Cubans and for the North Americans who went there. And on the final day, which was August 13th, Fidel's birthday, his, I think, 93rd birthday, was the day that we left. But we had the honor of going to his memorial, his gravesite, in Santiago. His remains are in a huge boulder, which is symbolic of the strength of the Cuban Revolution. And there's just a plaque with his name, no dates of birth, death, anything. And the Cubans say that's because Fidel is always with us. So we don't put a date of death. And we were honored in a way to visit on his birthday in the morning, right after his partner, his widow, had visited, and we followed her to the gravesite with the Cubans, and it was a very emotional day. It was also that was the day we were leaving. We had worked with a group of Cubans, I think about 10 or 12 Cubans who were from ECAP, who were part of the of our delegation. They worked with us in the fields. They, we got to know them, and that was also quite an experience. We lived with them, we ate with them, and learned about their lives. They learned about us. We talked about what we were doing. And again, they were always stressing, come to Cuba, send people to Cuba. We're very, whatever we have, we share. The little bit we have, we share. And that's really what they did. But, and we came back with a commitment to continue to work to end the blockade, to return Guantanamo to the Cuban people, and to end the travel ban. And we have begun having meetings doing that. When we were there, a lot of the new restrictions, while they had been announced, we didn't really see the effects. Many of the stores were well stocked, much more so than than when I had been there 20 years ago. People were working. There was even some traffic on the streets, more than usual. But since we've been back, we have heard of shortages, obviously, and the Cubans have planned for it. They began rationing, and again, central planning. It wasn't a shock to them. They had plans, and they say that this time it's going to be different. It's not going to be like the special period because, number one, they planned for it, and number two, they have really diversified their economy. As Gene said, the pharmaceutical industry has made deals with countries all over the world, except the United States, to sell or trade these tremendous new drugs that they have developed. And even though people in the U.S. can't get them, they can go. Jean mentioned this diabetes treatment that they have, which means that people no longer have to have limbs amputated, that they have a way to have some cells regenerate. And they're making it available, of course, but people in the U.S. can't get it. But they're invited to come down to Cuba if they want to be treated, and there are Americans down there being treated totally free. And so the Cubans have also diversified their agricultural development. I think they're now producing a little over half of the needs of the country, meaning they can import less. When the fuel became more restricted, the Cubans have decided also to be environmentally conscious. They now are manufacturing solar panels. They have a factory we visited, not on this trip, my last trip, we visited a farm. And of course, Cuba gets so much sun, it would be an obvious way to get a lot of energy. And the goal is by 2025, the 30% of the country, of the energy of the country will be solar, will be alternative, means solar and wind. So the Cubans are thinking ahead, and they're planning, and they have no intention of stepping back and no intention of making any concessions. We were even told by some official that the U.S. approached them and said that they would ease the sanctions and lift some of the restrictions if they would just abandon Maduro. They would just give up Maduro. And the Cubans would say, they don't get it. They don't understand that we never would sacrifice our principles for money. They don't get what we stand for. And that's really the bedrock of the Cuban ideology, is international solidarity. And they stick by that steadfastly. And so in light of a lot of these developments, the Cubans have become very proactive in advancing the struggle for socialism, the struggle for more left support. One of the first things they did was have an international conference in Havana this last weekend against imperialism and neoliberalism. Of course, the party participated. We sent a delegation of 4 comrades, and I think there'll be a more extensive meeting where none of them could be here today, but to report on it. But I will just say that there was over 1,300 delegates from 86 countries that attended. They've come up with a declaration of solidarity for the future and what the demands are, and working with international organizations. President Maduro spoke on the last day. He spoke for an hour and a half to the body, and reports that we heard was that it was a fantastic speech, laced with international solidarity, not just between Cuba and Venezuela, but Bolivia, Argentina, Chile, Ecuador, and many, many countries that are now having an upsurge against colonialism and imperialism. Finally, that culminated in a UN resolution that the Cuban government proposes every year, and they have proposed since 1992, demanding an end to the blockade, the commercial, financial, and economic blockade, calling for an immediate end. And the debate they had was in the UN was yesterday, and today was the vote. And every year the vote is nearly unanimous. Only the US and Israel vote against. It's usually about 190 to 2. During the Obama years, when there was a little bit of closer to normalization, the U.S. actually abstained and didn't vote against. But, and Israel, of course, was a lapdog and did whatever the U.S. said. But now with Trump and the tightening of restrictions, the U.S. has been a little more aggressive. Last year, they tried to gum up the works by adding all these amendments to try to distract and delay and get some countries, always about human rights, you know, that Cuba violates human rights, or that they're causing instability in Venezuela. But everyone was voted down, and last year was an overwhelming vote in favor. This year, the U.S. didn't decided against the amendments. Instead, they tried to pick off some countries that have had right-wing elections where they've elected right-wing leaders. They particularly tried to get Brazil, Colombia, some of those countries to vote against. Unfortunately, this year, Brazil did vote against, but they were the only country, besides the U.S. and Israel, to vote against. And the final vote was 187-3 in favor of it. But more than just the vote, comrades, I sat in the UN chamber today and listened to the speeches. I think Sarah was there yesterday. And to talk about international solidarity, it was really remarkable to see country after country, representative from country after country, predominantly, of course, from Africa, Latin America, and Asia, none of the white countries, show their support for the resolution, and many countries support for the Cuban Revolution. And it was just very moving to hear how these countries totally contradicted the U.S. position on human rights. This representative from South Africa, the first thing he said was he thanked Cuba for their significant contribution to their liberation, and reminded the world that the Cubans had a large part in the defeat of apartheid. The representative from Namibia, the same thing. Representatives from other African countries who were hit by the Ebola epidemic thanked Cuba for sending doctors and being the first country to respond, not run away from the Ebola, but to go right into it. Countries that suffered from natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, thanked the Cubans and always said, when there was an earthquake, the Cubans were there. The Cubans were always there. And it really showed how the Cubans have approached the world. International solidarity is the key. It's the bedrock of their ideology. The U.S. actually did speak, made absolutely offensive talk, calling the 30,000 doctors and other health professionals that are serving in 80 countries, I think they said, around the world, calling them forced labor, and that the Cubans take all their money and their passports and they're forced to work there. And yet, country after country thanked the Cubans for providing doctors there. Members of my family work in the health field internationally, and I have a brother who's with Doctors Without Borders, and every country he's been in, there's been Cuban doctors. And not one of them has ever been forced to be there. We even spoke to some of the Cubans who had been on medical missions. We visited a polyclinic, and they said that all the Cubans on medical missions is volunteer. Nobody is forced to go. They do it out of altruism, out of a love for humanity. That's what the Cuban Revolution is all about. The other thing the U.S., of course, raised is human rights and attacked Cuba for, only having one party and having 50,000 people, political prisoners, which is nonsense. But again, that was answered by many of the countries that spoke. In addition to the foreign minister of Cuba who spoke, Bruno Rodriguez Padilla, and he answered the U.S. point by point by point. Number one, saying the U.S. has no moral authority to speak about human rights. And raised how African-American youth are shot down in the street by police in the United States, how children are taken from their parents and put in cages, how men and women don't get the same pay in the United States. He went through the UN, the Declaration of Rights, point by point. He said, point, I don't know, 23, is that housing is a right. Everyone should have a home, and pointed out that there are 500,000 homeless people in the United States. Item, 25 is everyone should have medical care. But there's 6 million people in the United States without medical insurance. And many people who even have it can't afford it or can't afford medical care. And he went point by point, showing how it's Cuba, the Cubans, who have brought human rights to not only themselves but to many countries, and helping in their struggle. After that speech, they took the vote. It was 187-3. Those of us who were there was then a rally down at the Cuban mission in support. The Cuban representative to the mission came out. It was a very successful day and very important internationally for the Cubans, and they do this every year. But really, our job is to show our international solidarity with the Cuban people and with the Cuban revolution, and to do everything we can to encourage people to go, either on the Venceremos Brigade or on other trips. There's many other trips. It's an experience that any of us would gain from, but also as a good organizing tool to come back and talk about socialism. And to do whatever we can. There are many events coming up in the future which we'll learn about. Our party has been one of the fiercest supporters of the Cuban Revolution, and we will continue to be. Whatever support is necessary, we will provide if we can. And with that, Viva Fidel, Viva Cuba Socialista.